All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. For anyone who is joining late, we will be diving right into the content here in a couple of minutes. So welcome to today's webinar, the business case and quality assessments for nature-based solutions. My name is Amanda Russo, and I am the head of demand generation at Terraformation and will be your webinar host today. We're so excited to have you. We have a great lineup of speakers and discussion topics prepared for you today. Before we get started, though, I am going to run through some logistical items and then we'll dive right in. So for our agenda today, we will be beginning with some introductions and then we'll transition into our moderated panel discussion and ending with Q&A and next steps. Some reminders before we begin. We have been collecting pre-submitted questions during registration, but we will be leaving time for live Q&A at the end of the webinar. So please vote on top questions so we know which questions are relevant to a majority of you. And if we're not able to get to your question today, we can follow up if you're interested. And FYI that we will be sending out a recording of today's session after the webinar concludes. And we have a wonderful lineup of speakers involved in today's session. So I'm going to briefly introduce them. So the companies presenting today, if you're not familiar with them, and then we'll also be introducing our wonderful panelists. So first up, we have Terraformation. Terraformation is a native forest restoration company dedicated to rapidly expanding the number of large-scale biodiverse forest projects. We equip forestry teams with training, technology, and access to capital, ensuring the creation of successful carbon projects. Our expertise in capacity building, community co-benefits, and carbon market funding supports the development of high-quality investable forests. Next up, we have the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy is a global environmental nonprofit working to conserve the lands and waters of which all life depends. So TNC works to advance natural climate solutions through many strategies, including high-quality carbon markets. For over 20 years, TNC has pioneered carbon project innovations and engaged with key carbon market stakeholders to advocate for comprehensive market improvements. And last but certainly not least, we have Sylvera. And Sylvera is a carbon data platform on a mission to incentivize investment in real climate action. Global corporations, financial institutions, and governments rely on Sylvera to develop and execute their carbon credit strategies, drive measurable progress toward net zero goals, and optimize ROI. And next up, now that you've learned more about the companies involved today, I wanted to take some time to highlight our wonderful moderator and panelists, Tom, Max, and Annalise. I'm going to give them some time to introduce themselves before we begin with a poll question.
I'll kick things off since I'm the first photo on the screen. Hi, everybody. I'm Tom Van Pola. I've been with Terraformation for just a couple of months, and I'm leading climate investments here. And so what that really means is that we create all these really great reforestation projects, and we need to find a way to make those projects continue long into the future. So we look for off-takers and investors in order to fund the planting to make these projects possible. Prior to my role here at Terraformation, I got my start in carbon markets working in the improved forest management space, and then actually moved on to Sylvera, where Annalise and I were colleagues for almost 2 years.
I can go next. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Maximiliano Bernal Temores. I've been part of the Global Carbon Markets team at TNC for almost 2 years now, and my role focuses mostly on VCM, policy, and stakeholder engagement, mostly on the demand side of the market. And my background is more on the environmental consulting side. I am based in Washington, D.C., and I'm originally from Guadalajara, Mexico.
I'm Annalise Downey. I've been with Sylvera for going on, I guess it'll be 5 years in November, and have seen the evolution of the carbon credit ratings, pre-issuance assessments and ratings, some of the market data that we've seen. And part of my role as head of climate consulting is to make sure that our customers know all of the data and tooling that they have available to them within the platform, but then also how to use it to make decisions about portfolio composition, how to access different kinds of projects, how to integrate the data into their decision making, because I think, as we'll sort of get into today, most people in the carbon market can recite the core carbon principles by now, but what's more unclear are the thresholds, or how you actually assess additionality or carbon quantification at a project level. So that's part of my role at Sylvera. In a previous life, I also worked with the Nature Conservancy doing coral reef restoration. So my background is at the intersection of climate and technology, but always a focus on nature as well. And yes, Tom was stuck with me for about 2 years at Sylvera, working together and working closely. So glad to be here again with him.
I'm going to hand things over to Tom and stop sharing my screen to begin with the moderated panel discussion.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. And as I moderate the discussion, I'll also be providing some perspectives from Terraformation as well. So I'll try to balance those two things. But to get things started, I'd say we will kick off with one of the biggest themes in today's market, which is project integrity. When I hear people talk about integrity today, it's no longer enough to just see a number on a registry. Buyers that I speak with specifically want to know that the carbon is real. They want to know it's visible, measurable, and tied to real outcomes on the ground. So Annalise and Max, from your perspectives, what does a high integrity carbon credit look like in 2025? And how should buyers evaluate that? Annalise, maybe we'll start with you.
Thanks, Tom. I think the place to start from a corporate perspective or an investor perspective is starting with the end in mind. So what is your intended use case for that credit? Is it a compliance commitment? Is it a beyond value chain mitigation claim? Is it about neutralization? And then your endpoint will help you determine what kind of characteristics you actually need from the projects you procure from. Corporate buyers will also set criteria based on their cultural DNA, what matters to them as an organization. So let's say I'm a pharmaceutical company. I may care about projects that also contribute not just to, let's say, a nature-based outcome, but also that contribute to community health and well-being. And that may be a criteria that I look for in projects. Once you have your guidelines or your principles, your kind of criteria for how you want to navigate project-based procurement, or setting criteria at the portfolio level, then you can dig into what quality means at the level of the underlying asset or the project level. And you're absolutely right, Tom. The documentation, the sort of program level issuance process is no longer enough for carbon credit buyers and investors to have a green light for a transaction. I think those days are over. Now, buyers, investors will want to run their own due diligence process, understand what's happening at the project, and they will also likely ask for a higher level of data than is provided at the registry. And as I mentioned, I think by now most people in the market can recite the core carbon principles, but still what's unclear is how that actually gets operationalized at the project level. So buyers and investors will set up their own process for the kind of criteria and exit criteria that a project has to go through to make it through different stages of, let's say, like qualification, transaction, and monitoring. And so what corporates will do, or investors will do, they'll have their own criteria. They will do their own level of diligence on the project, but they will also bring in independent parties like Sylvera, who really are here to build and use frameworks for understanding the likelihood that one carbon credit is equal to 1 unit of carbon. And that is like so diverse between project types, but even within project types themselves. So if I'm thinking about integrity, for what integrity means or quality means for an afforestation, reforestation, and revegetation project, or ARR, there's a wealth of eligible activities that fit into that ARR category. And what drives the criteria for quality matters if it's and varies if it's a large scale commercial plantation, if it is an agroforestry project, if it is a mangrove restoration project. So let's say I'm looking at an agroforestry project. I certainly want to understand the approach to quantifying and monitoring above ground biomass and SOC carbon stock changes, but I also want to understand the way that the project is engaging with farmers, building end markets for their crops, and even managing a seedling pipeline, because all of these conditions of the project are really going to matter, of course, for carbon quantification, but also for the permanence of impact. So lots of different variables to assess. And part of the criteria starts at the corporate level or the individual buyer and investor level, and there are tools from carbon credit ratings agencies and data providers to help implement that due diligence at a project level to make sure that the projects that you are procuring from or investing in have real carbon impact and community impact as well.
Thanks, Annalise. I mean, there's so much that goes into, I think, assessing what a high integrity project looks like. Max, let's hear from you. It'd be good to get your perspective.
No, and first, I completely agree with what Annalise was saying, and I think what she was getting at is that integrity can look very different for different types of projects, and also integrity is changing. It's not a static destination; it is continuously improving. But having said that, from a broader perspective, TNC has been developing projects for more than 20 years, and we distilled this experience into this document that we call our internal bar of excellence, which is a set of principles and criteria to ensure a minimum high quality of TNC carbon projects. And we include criteria on additionality, durability, socio-environmental safeguards, and more. Maybe Amanda can help me put the link in the chat to the external version of this document if people want to get a deeper dive. But where I want to go with this is that TNC's principles and criteria are actually highly aligned with ICVCM's core carbon principles, the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. So I would broadly align behind ICVCM's definition of the minimum bar for a high integrity carbon credit. But like Annalise was saying, I also recognize that ICVCM's work is just starting and it's a spectrum. We have only seen a few of ICVCM's assessments come out, so we have yet to see ICVCM's true impact. So while we wait for them to release these results and for the accepted methodologies to issue credits and for the many projects to adapt to this new threshold, the look of a high integrity carbon credit will have to be assisted by these in-depth independent due diligence by corporates that really raise the need for tools like rating agencies like Sylvera.
Yeah, I think from hearing both you, Max, you and Annalise speak, there's a lot of different criteria, and if I'm to try to like summarize some of those and what I heard, I think like additionality is of course really critical. So if we're thinking about an ARR project, would the forest exist without the project itself? If the answer is yes, that credit isn't doing its job. There's also the permanence. You've got to show that the carbon is going to stay out of the atmosphere for the long haul. I'd say we could probably all agree that transparency is huge. Buyers need visibility into data, the monitoring, the assumptions. There can't be any more black boxes in this space. I think that we've realized that over many years and a lot of criticism. And finally, I think there's a really strong community component to this too. And it's not just involvement, but true ownership and economic benefit. And that's what really, I think, keeps projects going. I also think, from my perspective, we've moved past this era where third-party certification alone is enough. Buyers should be asking, and I think many of them are, what species are being planted, who manages the land, what's the plan for drought or fire? And those are all really important questions that need to be answered. And so at Terraformation, we're thinking about how to do that by pairing native biodiversity with some really efficient operational timelines. And when developing our Terraware platform, we wanted to track everything from that initial seed collection to growing the forest. That way, we can move fast without sacrificing things like transparency or quality. But we also believe throughout this process that the best guarantee of permanence is community ownership. When locals are economically invested in the health of the forest, they become its most reliable protectors and provide generational stewardship. So if I'm to summarize a lot of the things that I heard and what I think about a high integrity credit, it really isn't just about removing carbon, although that's a really important component to it. It's about building something lasting on the ground and specifically something that people trust. So let's move on to a new topic. Another big theme in the market and something that I started to hear come up a little bit is targets. Many companies are falling behind on their SBTI and net zero goals. So Max and Annalise, from your perspective, what's causing that gap and how can nature-based solutions help to bridge it? Max, let's start with you this time.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'd love to start on this one. If we're asking why companies are not meeting their targets with internal emission reductions, which we know they're not, there's a lot of evidence. Most recently, Accenture reported that only 16% of the biggest 2,000 companies are on track to reach net zero by 2050. Well, I would say, and focusing mostly on scope 3 emissions, which are where companies are struggling the most, and these emissions normally represent the biggest portion of a company's inventory. The problem overall is that these emissions are not readily abatable. What I mean with this is that companies either don't have sufficient traceability to their emission sources or enough control to really influence them, or the solutions are just plain cost prohibitive. To explain it a little better, companies often do not have the data necessary to understand their emission profiles. For Scope 3, many companies still rely on estimations, industry averages, incomplete data sets. So companies really don't have the understanding necessary to develop those mitigation plans. They also, a lot of them do not have or have minimal leverage over their value chains. The emissions normally originate several tiers upstream or downstream from a company's direct control. This is especially true for small and medium-sized companies. And finally, even if they have information and control, the transition to low carbon alternatives normally is very costly and in many cases technologically out of reach, especially for hard to abate sectors and companies in low income economies. TNC thinks that carbon credits, when used with strong guardrails for quality, can provide that affordable and scalable mitigation tool that is available and finances underfunded nature-based solutions. And we think that companies should use them, especially NCS removals and reductions, to address those non-readily abatable emissions so that we do not risk derailing global net zero goals while they're still investing in addressing those barriers that I just mentioned. But unfortunately, current climate frameworks don't really allow companies to substantially use credits to stay in conformance with their targets. So, with the challenges companies are facing to decarbonize internally and the lack of those tools to stay on track with their targets, we are risking companies starting to drop out of these voluntary, after all, climate frameworks. And we're starting to see some evidence of that.
Yeah, I mean it's always disheartening to see some companies that are dropping out, but also to see that there are possibilities for companies to step back in and even do some more. Annalise, it'd be great to get your perspective.
Yeah, I think sometimes we kind of lose sight of the reason that we're here, or that I think a lot of us are here, which is that we as like individuals within society understand that climate change needs to be addressed. Climate change is a system change. It's transnational. The atmosphere doesn't really care about corporate accounting boundaries between companies, but it is an important mechanism for something like SBTI or ISO to set corporate level accountability and a corporate level framework for action so that we can mobilize the private sector across industries and across geographies. And there's a suite of reasons, as I won't dive into because Maximilian did a way better job than I would have, but for the reasons that he mentioned, companies are growing, decarbonization levers are too expensive, the technology may not be there. There were optimistic assumptions baked into their pathways. And it is also not just a question of like, do I have the data available? But sometimes these decarbonization efforts span geographies, they span teams within an organization. And so it really is a challenge to like mobilize human resources and individuals and teams that sometimes have competing interests in mind or competing sort of incentives. And so it is like a human problem as much as it is a data problem as well. And yeah, we're not measuring molecules here yet. We're relying on a strong set of assumptions for corporate level accounting. But I really view SBTI and ISO as a mechanism for companies to demonstrate meaningful engagement with decarbonization and for stakeholders like people of civil society, of regulators, to really be able to make a distinction between the companies that are making a genuine effort to decarbonize and account for their climate impact and those who are not. It's not necessarily about like beating corporates over the head with their targets. It's about the level of engagement with the problem, because this is like a multi-year, multi-decade effort for companies to decarbonize. It's no easy task. And so in the context of carbon credits within SBTI, there are areas of utility. One is like, what do you do about the emissions that you have every year along the way towards your path, towards your net zero target? And then what do you do at the point of net zero? How do you neutralize your residual emissions? And CDR pathways like bio-CCS or so biogenic carbon capture and storage or direct air capture, they need time to scale and bring the cost curve down before everyone can sort of show up to the market and procure those credits. Those technologies are important and definitely play a role within the global transition to like a more sustainable business environment. And corporates have a role in sending that long-term demand signal for those CDR pathways, but NBS is here today. It's also cost effective. And if you think about net zero as like a global challenge, you can't ignore nature as a solution within the global net zero transition. We have significant land-based emissions to account for, and we need to restore areas in a way that is aligned with biodiversity and resilience. So if you are a buyer, your portfolio should kind of reflect the levers that we have to pull for a global transition to net zero. And we need to drive that action today and at a reasonable cost, and NBS credits fit the bill for all of the above.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I think it's really interesting to see and hear from you about like there are a lot of companies that they're genuinely trying. I think in general, it sounds like there's a lot of companies that face a tough mix of changing standards. There's some market uncertainty, and in many cases, there's not enough high quality supply to meet their needs. And I think nature-based solutions, especially reforestation, can help. In fact, reforestation is probably the most established carbon removal system that we have. It's grounded in decades of science. It's scalable with the right technology and financing, and delivers a lot of great co-benefits like biodiversity, water security, and livelihoods. But I think one of the challenges, though, is that today these solutions, they haven't scaled fast enough. And so here at Terraformation, like that's why we created a solution that combines ecological integrity with operational speed so that reforestation can become a true climate infrastructure investment. But I think one of the biggest blockers to all of that is finance. Corporate timelines are usually pretty short, and forest projects play out over decades. And so that mismatch really does slow everything down. But it can be addressed through blended finance. At least that's what we're starting to see. We can get capital in early so that projects can get going now, even if the credit revenue happens to be years away. And the key to long-term success with these projects is ownership, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. We ensure our projects are co-managed by local communities who share in the economic benefits, and we believe that creates real durability. So I'd say maybe the bottom line here is that we don't need necessarily a miracle technology here. We really just need to scale what we have today, and one of those solutions is forests. So to continue the conversation, let's talk a bit more about standards. Specifically, what role are things like the SBTI net zero standard, ICVCM, and VCMI playing in how credits are used, reported, and trusted? Annalise, we'll get started with you.
Thanks, Tom. I think the alphabet soup, the SBTI, ISO, ICVCM, VCMI, they're all mechanisms for supporting the legitimacy of carbon markets, but also for private sector action on climate change. Businesses need a business case before they are going to spend money or mobilize capital, particularly at a large scale. And we're making progress on private sector action on climate change, but it's not really yet a competitive norm enabled by trusted market infrastructure. And so the institutions like VCMI, like ICVCM, like SBTI, they play a role in setting the rules of the game by saying that you need to care about integrity and this is what the floor is. And it's not sufficient just to focus on supply side integrity, but you also need the buy side to acknowledge that integrity matters. And this is what integrity is, so that they can send the demand pull for high quality credits. And buyers need to know that, like, what quality means and how that can be operationalized. And really what we're looking for here is for that demand side signal to be able to identify what quality means and to pay a premium for it, so that the supply that meets those thresholds, that exceeds those thresholds, that are truly high quality in the sense of carbon quantification and durability and community benefits, are being rewarded, and that those are the solutions that scale, and that we're not being sort of held down by a collection of lower quality projects.
Max, how about you?
Thank you. I think trust is the key word in here. I think the VCM is either in a crisis or in a transition period, but it's mostly because of trust. The criticisms that we see from market skeptics and lawsuits mostly come down to them not trusting that a carbon credit really represents a full ton of carbon. And ICVCM is directly addressing this by defining what the minimum high integrity credit looks like, and it assesses current standards and methodologies against this definition. And this process involves independent experts that contribute through working groups and review processes that ensures, or hopefully will ensure, that only high integrity credits receive this CCP label. And this expertise of the process is allowing ICVCM really to rebuild this trust of stakeholders, allowing a significant portion of them to get behind their work and bringing some consistency to what otherwise is right now a pretty fragmented market. And outside of credit quality, stakeholders have been disagreeing on what appropriate use of credits should be, mostly differing in how credits either complement or substitute internal decarbonization. Stakeholders really have come against climate neutral frameworks, suggesting that companies should be following the mitigation hierarchy, prioritizing internal decarbonization. But this has left companies really uncertain about how they should be using credits. And this is where VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, and SBTI come in, providing companies with guidance on the role, or sometimes maybe the lack thereof, that credits will have in their respective frameworks. SBTI is the leading corporate climate standard setter. Approximately 10,000 companies have a target or have committed to setting one. So it really influences corporate climate strategies. But unfortunately, in its current version of the standard, it really limits the role of carbon credits in corporate climate strategies. Right now, like Annalise was saying, they can only use credits to neutralize residual emissions, pretty much waiting until 2050, or optionally to go beyond their targets and contribute to beyond value chain mitigation. But in the most recent update to its standard that was under consultation until last week, SBTI is considering expanding this credit use into potentially also allowing companies to use credits to address Scope 1 underperformance, or to address Scope 3 emissions if there are significant barriers to decarbonize internally, and to neutralize residual emissions, not waiting until 2050, but on the path to 2050. And on the other hand, VCMI is more focused specifically on providing guidance on how to use credits versus broad decarbonization like SBTI. And it proposes two uses: beyond climate targets with their carbon integrity claims, or to address underperformance in Scope 3 targets through the newest Scope 3 claims code of practice. So in short, ICVCM, I think, increases market alignment and trust in credits through its broadly agreed upon expert assessments, and VCMI and SBTI are still wrestling with defining what the appropriate use of credits really should be.
Yeah, thanks for that. I feel like both you and Annalise did a really good job of giving a pretty clear picture of how these standards are operating in the market, some of the benefits and challenges. One thing that was mentioned was consistency. And if I think about a lot of the conversations that I've had with folks at conferences and a lot of the things that I've overheard, I'll just double click on the fact that the market does feel pretty fragmented at times. But I think that these standards give everyone a shared language. they help buyers tell the difference between real climate impact and just good marketing. And the pressure that the standards are putting on all of us, developers, buyers, verifiers, I think is actually really good. It's raising the bar, and that's what the market needs to rebuild trust. When buyers, for example, have clear guidance on what high integrity means, it gives them confidence to act. And I think that that's what can unlock some of that capital that's really needed in this space. And so one of the things at Terraformation that we're doing, like we're designing projects that align with the standards from the start. We have this accelerator model that equips our partners with the documentation, processes, and the tools needed to meet some of these evolving verification and disclosure requirements. And so we believe that standards will increase or increasingly demand real-time visibility. And so by making our solution open sourced, we can build for the future. We can track everything from planting to carbon outcomes with transparency at every stage of the process. So I think, like, to summarize, like I really do think we need to think of the standards more than just red tape, which I know is kind of popular in the space to think of them as, because they're the blueprint for scaling trust in this market, and that's really critical to encourage capital to continue to flow to projects.
Maybe just add to one more thing, Tom. I mean, a lot of us have been in the market for a while. We know our way around. We know the acronyms, the alphabet soup, like all of the lingo. But what we're building today is not really like for the buyers here right now. It's for the next wave of buyers. It's making it easier for people to have a starting point to learn from the mistakes that we've made, the successes that we've had, so that they can start immediately on their carbon credit journey as well as their net zero journey. So really, it is about making it easier for the people sort of behind the next wave of buyers and investors to participate, because that is absolutely what we need for the market to scale, and so that like finance can flow to projects that are high quality.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Max, so a question specifically for you. TNC's new report outlines 4 use cases for carbon credits. Can you walk us through how those can help buyers take action and what opportunities that creates for accelerating progress?
Yeah, totally. And thank you for letting me plug our most recent report. I really appreciate that. In the Bending the Curve report, and maybe Amanda, if you could help me share the link to the executive summary in the chat. DNC presents 4 use cases showing how we envision the voluntary use of credits by corporates from now to 2050 and beyond. And because at the moment, as I said earlier, there's a lot of disagreement about what the appropriate use of credit should look like. So we really are hoping that this report will put TNC's trusted voice in the conversation, clearly communicating to buyers, regulators, standard setters, NGO partners, everyone right here in this conversation, what TNC considers to be appropriate use of credits. And hopefully this will push the needle to convince current frameworks and regulations the need to open the door a little wider for corporates to use credits as part of their net zero strategies, ideally reducing the risk of backlash that is very real for companies right now. And maybe to quickly summarize the 4 use cases that we present, maybe I'll try sharing my screen. Go. Okay, perfect. I think people should be seeing it now. So we have closing the near-term emission gap, number 1, addressing unabated emissions, neutralizing residual emissions, and 4 at the beginning, taking responsibility for historic emissions. The first use case, it involves companies using credits to address the non-readily abatable emissions that I was talking about to stay on track with the net zero island pathway. This is currently the most important use case that we are advocating for because, as we discussed, companies are struggling to meet their targets. And this use case is partially exemplified in VCMI's Scope 3 cutoff practice that allows companies to use credits to address that Scope 3 underperformance, and also in SBTi's newest proposal of using credits to address Scope 1 underperformance. The second use case in dark green is using credits to address unabated emissions. So those ongoing emissions as companies continue to work towards net zero. This would be the case, for instance, of BCMI's carbon integrity claims, where companies that are already on track to meet their targets can go above and beyond by contributing with further mitigation. The third use case is neutralizing residual emissions. Again, those are the ones that cannot feasibly be eliminated by 2050, representing approximately 10% of baseline emissions. And there is broad agreement that we need to start neutralizing these emissions by 2050 at the latest, with mitigation outside of a company's value chain. So it is a very clear case for credits. And SBTI does allow for the use of removals in 2050 to neutralize these emissions. But like I said, SBTI is right now considering implementing interim neutralization targets to ensure that we are scaling the infrastructure like Annalise was suggesting so that we have it ready to neutralize all residual emissions by 2050. And the last use case, after a company reaches net zero and they neutralize all residual emissions and decarbonize their value chain, they can go even more above and beyond by addressing their historic emissions, which are the emissions that companies had even before setting their targets. And I know this sounds far away and out of reach right now, but it is important to start recognizing that we will have to address an emission overshoot in 2050, and credits play a role, will likely play a role then. So overall, we'd like to see companies use credits in a way that really are balancing the risk of over-reliance on credits with the risk of having unattainable decarbonization pathways.
Great. No, thank you for sharing that. And for all those on the call, whether they're buyers who need access to that, we'll make sure to provide it as a follow-up. But for everyone else on the call, any other suppliers, NGOs on the call, it's really good to understand the landscape in the marketplace and how these things, how these can be used as we're all shaping our own internal strategies. Annalise, even though we've worked together for 2 years, I'm gonna put you on the spot. You're not gonna escape me. I've got a question for you as well. From your perspective, how should buyers use tools like Sylvera's rating when making procurement decisions?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think there's a number of ways that buyers set criteria for how they want to access the market, how they want to go about projects. And I think one of the questions that was submitted ahead of time was really focusing on like methodologies and how should buyers and investors think about what methodologies that projects use, which makes a lot of sense because the ICVCM sort of started with the methodologies, and the methodologies having integrity start at the point of like where and how projects are being created. I mean, methodologies are like the recipe. They set the norms, the expectations, the kind of data that you are expected to report. So it's a great place to start, but methodologies are really the floor for quality. You can have a great methodology yield a high risk project. You can have a poor methodology yield a fantastic project. And so for buyers, I see them using methodologies as a way to kind of determine what questions they ask of projects. But I think those who are more like mature and have been in the carbon market for a while, let's just take the example of afforestation, reforestation projects where there's a lot of focus on VM47. Methodologies don't necessarily fit but they're not like fit for purpose for all projects. There are project developers that I speak to who say, well, actually the Plan Vivo methodology aligns better with my project conditions, or the ERS standard and methodologies align better to my projects. And so we don't, as a buyer, as an investor, you don't want to sort of shunt out the high quality projects just because they use a different methodology. So for buyers to be able to navigate like what are the risks between methodologies, what should I be looking for? Yes, they're sort of understanding the methodologies, but they also want to have the project level diligence and understand how the methodology is being applied. And then there are also some other characteristics that the methodologies don't necessarily cover. So I was speaking to a Mexican IFM project developer the other day, and the CAR Mexican IFM protocol already like does a lot above and beyond other methodologies for the engagement with communities, because these are like ejido-based community projects. But the project developer still felt that it wasn't sufficient to actually reflect how they were engaging with their communities and the grievance mechanisms in place. So it's like another way that they were going above and beyond what the methodology requires, but is not necessarily something that shows up in project documentation, because you have a VVB coming in to say, are you following the rule of the letter of the methodology? And so if you are adding ancillary information, the VVB might tell you to cut that out. But that is important, like material information for a buyer and an investor. So Sylvera's ratings capture those nuances that occur between methodologies and the actions that product developers take above and beyond what the methodology requirements are, and as they should be. And so that's just really the project level diligence. But I saw another question come through about buyers facing a tough balancing act between price, volume, integrity, and impact. So yeah, I'm watching all these questions come in. There's another question about like, can you use an ERPA or an offtake for carbon projects? Does SBTI recognize that? And so there's like all kinds of nuances and processes that we take for granted in the carbon market, like what does it mean to retire a credit? What does issuing a credit actually mean? So part of what my role is and Sylvera's role is to help buyers understand all these like processes that sit behind the market infrastructure of the carbon market, and understand and sort of like translate that for a corporate who is entering the space newly, to understand like, yeah, how does a credit come to be? How does it get retired? At what point do I get to like use that credit? And we've been talking a lot about offtakes in the market for the last, I don't know, year, because we've realized that we actually don't have a large amount of high quality supply available today. So if you were to go to the spot market to find a high integrity ARR project, you would be hard pressed. Those credits are spoken for. So what does that mean? We need to go upstream to earlier stages of projects and provide long-term demand signals or financing. And so this is the kind of mechanism that offtakes play, which is that you're sending a long-term demand signal for a project and helping to sort of equalize the supply of credits that you have coming into your pipeline as a corporate retiree, so that you can kind of spread across vintages or spread across like the points that you will use those credits as well. So yes, Sylvera provides project level integrity assessments and ratings, but there's also this kind of like process support about how do you actually operationalize a carbon procurement program that aligns to like long-term usage, not just procurement within a single year.
Yeah, I think, from things that I've been hearing in the market, there's a lot of folks out there that are starting to rely more and more on third-party perspectives to help them develop their strategies and understand the market. So it's really good to see Sylvera doing a lot of that work in the space, and being such a strong voice in the market. I want to make sure we leave some time for some questions. So we'll wrap up with a forward-looking note, and one last question from me. What's one risk or opportunity that you're watching most closely in the 2025 carbon market landscape? Max, let's get started with you.
Thank you. I know we're running short on time, so I'll be very brief with this one. I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens with the Green Claims Directive negotiations in Europe, and with, as I've been mentioning a lot today, with SBTI's update on the corporate net zero standard. And I'm not really sure if there are opportunities or risks, but as a quick summary for the audience, the Green Claims Directive is current legislation in the European Union that really could potentially heavily restrict or guide how European buyers can use credits towards their green claims. And for SBTI, like I mentioned, it is considering a handful of ways in which companies may be able to use credits as part of their climate strategies. So overall, really, we're in this pivotal moment when stakeholders are defining what good use of credits looks like. And there seems to start to be growing understanding that value chains alone won't result in fast enough progress to meet climate goals. So maybe we're heading for more middle ground, but still really TBD. But either ways, buyers really need clarity right now. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
Thanks, Max. Annalise, how about you?
I'll pick a risk and an opportunity that is more at the project level, but I'm really following the emergence and adoption of dynamic baselining across project types. I think it's a really great sort of frontier application for technology and data. But as the space evolves, I think we need to be very focused on how we can enable buyers and investors to meaningfully compare service and data offerings. I think with Earth observation and remote sensing, model accuracy and like regional performance are very technical topics. And sometimes buyers and investors, they don't really know what questions to ask. They don't know how to compare offerings. So I think from like a market functioning perspective, independent of like a Sylvera or a Terraformation, like we need to provide tools for the market to be able to sort of identify what good looks like within dynamic baselining and what uncertainty means or what model performance means, and just providing like a common framework for assessment and a common sort of like language within the models.
Yeah, it's an important insight for, for anybody looking for carbon credits or even those like us developing them, and what some of the other third parties perspectives are looking at. The biggest risk that I see is continued buyer skepticism, and not because the market isn't valuable. I think people recognize that it is, but because a lot of the past failures have made it harder to trust what's real. And if that trust erodes further, it's really easy to stall out just as we need to accelerate. But there's also a clear shift that I see happening. There's an ecosystem marketplace report that shows that while overall market activity is down, demand for high quality carbon removal is increasing. And I think that that's where the opportunity lies. Nature-based removals like ARR, like mangrove restoration and agroforestry, they're leading the way. And these are the largest category of removal credits that are available, and they're finally being recognized with a meaningful price premium, which is really important to continue to drive the market forward. We believe that nature-based solutions will move from the sidelines and start moving more into the center. So if they're done well, reforestation delivers not only carbon but also biodiversity. It's delivering water security, livelihoods, and jobs, and that's the value that we're betting on here at Terraformation. The risk, though, it's retreat. The opportunity, though, is definitely renewal, and that's a renewal of trust, ecosystems, and climate ambition. So for the moderated portion of the panel, I'll stop it there, and I'll hand things back over to Amanda for some of the audience questions that have been coming in.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tom. Really interesting conversation today from all of the panelists. We do want to move into Q&A. So we did collect some questions when we were promoting out the webinar, and have a couple of prepared. And then we would love to get the opportunity for any live questions to come in. So friendly reminder to vote on top questions. I see a lot of great themes in here about SBTI. So if that resonates with you, please give that an upvote, and we'll leave some time to ask some of those. So first things first, I wanted to ask, what role does nature-based solutions play in a broader carbon portfolio, and how important are biodiversity and social co-benefits in companies' decision-making? Does someone want to take that one first?
Happy to take that one. I think absolutely that nature-based solutions play a critical role in corporates and investors' portfolios today. One of the sort of promising things is not only that there is a correlation between price and quality, but when you look into the data, and I can maybe also share Sylvera's State of the Carbon Market report, but what that shows, particularly for ARR projects, is that even within like a rating band, so a rating band would be like an A or a AA or a BBB, there is still variation in price, and that spread is actually caused by co-benefits. So projects that have high co-benefits across community and biodiversity, they do achieve a premium as well. So both carbon integrity and co-benefits performance.
I'll just add in with one real quick thing is that, I think the biodiversity and social impact, they're not just PR. I think they're talked a lot about as PR in a lot of ways, but I think they're a fundamental part of what gives these credits long-term credibility.
Maybe to add just like a couple of data points. I think the report that you were referring to, Tom, the ecosystem marketplace one, said that NCS is around 40% of the market, or it was in 2024. And for the premium that analyst was talking about, the data point that I've seen is that Vera's CCBA label, the Climate Community and Biodiversity Alliance standard, which is for socio-environmental co-benefits, credits see a price premium of around $3 to $4, which is pretty significant with the prices nowadays. So, I mean, voluntary climate action is all about the company's perception to stakeholders. So it makes sense that credits with better impact and stories will do better.
Yeah, and I think it's also some of the themes that we've been seeing within, like if you're looking at SD Vista or CCB labels, what we're seeing from earlier stage projects is that they're actually making more explicit the baseline status of the community contributions, or like the baseline for biodiversity, so that they can demonstrate like a net impact. And more we're moving away from like a superficial claim around a contribution to a sustainable development goal, but projects are now really carefully and mindfully thinking about like, what are the metrics that are relevant to my project? How can I demonstrate that I'm achieving those metrics, and like what data is going to support those metrics? And that is coming through more in yes, the reporting through registries, but then also high quality project developers like Terraformation. They have their own platforms for data provision where they provide this kind of information above and beyond for corporate buyers. And I think like shoring up on that language and understanding what retirees or buyers are looking for in the context of carbon credits beyond just a label is important.
Got it. Thank you. Another question that we got during registration, which I thought was interesting, is that someone would love some discussion on what the industry looks like under uncertainty and changing requirements. And I know that there's a lot of that happening right now. So yeah, handing this over to you all.
I can start with this one. I think that the market's always had a pretty great level of uncertainty. I don't think it's new. I think what's constant though, if we look at it, is that we know what needs to happen to avoid the worst climate outcomes. So yes, some of the methodologies and policies will keep evolving, but that shouldn't paralyze the action that we need to take. We need to focus on what we can control, which is investing in real and durable climate impact with transparency at its core.
I would double click on some things that have already been mentioned throughout the day or throughout this conversation. Like Tom mentioned earlier with the ecosystem marketplace report, we have seen that these uncertainty and changing requirements are making corporates a little less reluctant to engage right now. I think we saw trading go down by 30% from 2023 to 2024 based on that report. Probably because right now there's not a huge benefit of engaging in the market, since the risk of backlash is far greater than the risk of inaction. But I would like to frame this as the market being in a transition, as I think Annalise said earlier. We call these, we're working towards the BCM 2.0, where hopefully all these initiatives and changing requirements that we've been talking about will start to paint a very clear picture for companies to accelerate decarbonization.
Definitely.
think-
Go ahead,
I
Molly.
was going to say that I think the tracking sort of secondary activity or secondary market activity can be misleading, because when you look at the retirements have been consistently going up. And what we're seeing is that like this year, there will actually be a year where we see a significant decrease in issuance volumes. And then even more so like when you think about what is the available supply on the market, yes, the market is an oversupply technically just by like sheer volume. But then when you dig into quality indicators or vintage level requirements, the market becomes thinner and thinner. And I think like that in combination with green hushing and corporates just saying less about their climate action in general, we see like less noise, less activity, but the intention and the investment is there. And a lot of it is happening in pre-issuance and early stage projects because there's a recognition that we have an imbalance and that we have a shortage of high quality carbon credits. So we need to invest in so that they can issue in the future and that they will be ready for a closer point to 2030.
Got it. Thank you. I think changing regulations is actually a great segue into some of these questions that we're getting in the Q&A panel. So we've gotten a few questions in about the SBTI net zero standard. So I'd like to ask this one: do the panelists see opportunities for the corporate climate action to be better mobilized with the new draft version of the SBTI net zero standard?
I'm happy to start with this one. If I were to keep it very short, yes. Is it enough? I think we can keep pushing for a little more flexibility. We have yet to see what actually will be decided by SBTI. Right now, they were just doing all these proposals, like I said, on scope one underperformance, maybe using credits as insets or offsets to, well, let's not use the word offset, to address scope 3 emissions that have persistent barriers. Also, these interim neutralization targets. And still, we're trying to find mechanisms to incentivize beyond biochain mitigation. So I think SBTI for sure is starting to move towards these more market-friendly, recognizing the barriers that companies are seeing. So yes, I think we are going in the right direction now. I think the new CEO is doing a great job at listening to corporates better. But can we do more? Always.
I don't have anything to add to that. I thought that was great. I agree.
No, me neither. Agreed.
Mic drop. Great summary.
Exactly.